Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the origins of the Cold War, so how the Cold War started. This is going to be a little bit of a review from what we did at the end of the last unit. So your big objective today, the big things you should be able to tell me about are what made the United States and the Soviet Union these superpowers, what were the big ones, and then what were some examples of containment policies, what were some things we did to contain communism. So the standards we're working with today are Tennessee U.S. History Standards 73 and 74, which are describing the competition between the two superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union in the areas of arms development, economic dominance, ideology, role and location of NATO, SEATO, and the Warsaw Pact. Okay. I know you don't know what those are yet, but you will in a second. And explain containment policies, including the Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, and the Truman Doctrine. Okay. All right. So, what was the Cold War? Okay. A Cold War is the term we use to describe that rivalry between democracy and communism. Okay. That rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's going to be lots of different facets of this. We call it the Cold War because technically the United States and the Soviet Union never actually went to war with each other. Now, we did both go to war during this time. We just didn't go to war with each other. We just went to war supporting opposite sides in other wars. Korea, Vietnam, all of those are Cold War era wars. But the big competition was who could spread their ideas to more countries. So whenever everything was done and tallied up, who was going to win? Were there going to be more democratic countries or were there going to be more communist countries? So they're both superpowers. Both of these countries are relatively untouched by World War II. The U.S. was in a much better position at the end of World War II than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union lost 2 million people in World War II. The United States had not lost nearly that many people. Plus, part of the war was actually fought in the Soviet Union, and the only damage the United States took itself was Pearl Harbor. So, but all of that said, both of these countries still had plenty of money and very strong economies at the end of this war. So they're going to be able to pick up and go a lot faster than the rest of Europe is. So whenever other countries are looking for help, really the only people that can afford to help are us or the Soviet Union. So a couple of quick conferences I want to remind you about. The Yalta Conference that happened in February of 45. This is whenever the big three met to make plans for what's going to happen because they knew Germany was going to fall. So FDR, Churchill, and Stalin show up to talk about this. This is the one where they decided to split Germany into 4 different zones. So there would be a U.S., British, French, and Soviet zone. Yalta is also the place where Stalin says he will allow any countries he controls to hold free democratic elections to decide whether or not they want to be communist. He says that. He never actually does it, but he says he will. And then the Potsdam Conference happens in July of the same year. So this is a couple months later. This is the last big three meeting before the war was officially over, and this is the final split between the Soviet Union and America, because Stalin shows up at this meeting and he basically tells Truman that yeah, I'm not going to hold free democratic elections. No. And all the countries I control, they're going to be communist. I'm going to add them to the Soviet Union. And they fight over that, but you can't really force him to do anything. So the decision was made at the Potsdam Conference that each country would do what they wanted to in their own zone. The United Nations is created. This goes all the way back to that Atlantic Charter at the Atlantic Conference, one of the very first conferences of the war before we ever actually joined in 41. We went to the Atlantic Conference, and it basically said that we needed to set up some kind of organization to keep this from happening again. And this is what we come up with. The United Nations is established in 1945. And the whole goal of the United Nations is to prevent future wars. Okay, it does a lot more now, but at the time in 45, its goal was to keep countries from going to war again. It started with 50 different nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of us are going to use the UN as a forum or a pulpit, if you will, to spread their influence over their other nations. So they're going to use this as an example to spread their influence. We'll talk more about this later, but the United Nations is different from the League of Nations. One, because we joined it, right? We didn't join the League of Nations, but we joined the United Nations. And two, because the United Nations actually does have a military. So the United Nations can back up its decisions. And we'll talk about the UN Security Council later. But Security Council has 5 permanent members, and then the rest of the members rotate amongst the other countries. But the Soviet Union and the United States are both permanent. Russia and the Soviet Union are both permanent members of the Security Council. So, and one vote again, one veto cancels any decisions. So this kind of forced us to have to work together on some things before the United Nations would agree to send troops anywhere. After World War II, Stalin is going to set his sights on 3 countries he was occupying. Now, these are countries he had got control over during World War II by fighting the Germans off. So he gets Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. These 3 right here. Okay. He sets his sights on those 3 countries. Okay. He gets a lot more, but those are the 3 he wants right after World War II. And he's going to make all 3 of those satellite nations. Now, on paper, satellite nations were independent countries on paper, but they weren't really. They became puppet countries. These were nations that bordered the Soviet Union. They're going to become puppets. So they join the Soviet Union. They're not really given an option. Stalin takes them over and says, "You're in the Soviet Union now." But once they join the Soviet Union, theoretically, they have a vote in anything the Soviet Union does, but Russia's the head of the Soviet Union. So whenever Russia says, "This is what we're doing now," they set it up in such a way that the puppet states couldn't outvote him. So he is going to use the Soviets' influence to push even further, and he's going to end up taking over the rest of these. He's going to take over Romania and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and Albania. He's going to try really hard to get Greece and Turkey. We're going to talk about that. Okay. Winston Churchill gives a famous speech. It's called the Fulton Speech, in which he's describing what the Soviet Union is doing. He's talking about the Soviet Union taking over more and more and more countries, and just pushing and pushing and pushing and forcing all these countries to become communism or to become communist because they want to spread communism. He says that a shadow had fallen on Eastern Europe, which was cut off from the free world by an iron curtain. This iron curtain had fallen, and it was cutting off all of these countries from the goodness of democracy of Western Europe. And you start to see a really big divide in Europe. You have Eastern Europe, which was all satellite states and puppet countries for the Soviet Union, and then you have Western Europe, which was mostly democratic. And you've got this giant fight between the two. So the U.S. is going to not like the idea of spreading communism. So the U.S. comes up with a policy to stop it. And our policy to start with was containment. Okay. And that is exactly like what it says. Containment was the policy to prevent communism from spreading. So whatever's communist right now, that's fine. They get to stay communist, but we don't want them to get one more inch of territory. We want to keep them where they are. We don't want it to spread. Okay. So in order to keep it from spreading, we're going to do 2 things. The first thing we do is the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine is the reason why Greece and Turkey are not part of that map I just showed you. Okay. The Soviet Union was pushing hard to get Greece and Turkey. And one of the things they did was Greece and Turkey were both economically failing. They were about to go bankrupt. And the Soviet Union was offering them, money and all kinds of other stuff. And all they had to do was become communist and join the Soviet Union. And then we'll pay all your debts. The Truman Doctrine was an open commitment by the United States to help any nation that was fighting communism. We did it specifically for Greece and Turkey, but excuse me. But it's going to work for a lot of other countries too. So we are giving tons of money to Greece and Turkey as long as they stay democratic. Okay. This is going to come back and bite us because the Truman Doctrine doesn't mean you have to be a democracy. It just means you have to be fighting communism. So you're going to get a lot of countries who aren't really fighting communism that claim they are. So we loan them money. Then you have the Marshall Plan, which is, it's been called Europe's New Deal. Okay. It's $13 billion of help to Europe. Excuse me. That started New Deal type programs. It was ways for them to rebuild and create jobs so they can be self-supportive. Now, they did this specifically to prevent communism from spreading. If you can, it's back to why Britain never became communist, right? That they had a strong enough economy that things didn't get desperate enough for people to want to be communist. So it's us keeping it stable enough that people don't get desperate enough to try to become communist. After World War II, Germany is going to be divided into 4 different zones. Okay. So you have Eastern Germany, which was entirely Soviet. Then Northwestern Germany is going to be British. The very southwestern edge is going to be French, which makes sense because France is right here, right? This is the part that actually borders France. And then the southeastern portion that's bordering the rest of the Soviet Union, that's going to be the American zone. Now, there's one small problem, one teeny tiny little problem. The capital of Germany, Berlin, is entirely in the Soviet zone. And Britain, France, and the United States are not going to allow the Soviet Union to control the capital of Germany all on its own. So Berlin is going to be divided the same way. Berlin will be divided into one zone for each Allied member. So Eastern Berlin, Soviet. Then there was a French, British, and American sector of Berlin. And Stalin gets sick and tired of America, Britain, and France trying to influence his Soviet part of Germany through this area of Berlin, right? So basically what was happening is a lot of people were leaving the Soviet part of Germany and going into the democratic parts of Germany through this. Because it's a lot easier if you live here. If you live right here, it's a whole lot easier to just go straight down into Berlin than it is to go all the way over into here. Okay. So Stalin tries to stop that. Stalin is not happy with the West trying to influence his Soviet zone. So the Soviet Union tried to starve us out. Okay. They cut off all traffic to West Berlin. They excuse me, they stopped trains from getting in. They stopped cars from going in. They basically just cut us off completely. We could get no supplies. We could get no supplies into this part of Berlin. Nothing in, nothing out. So the point, the goal here was to starve the people until they became so desperate they kicked out all the democratic countries and became Soviet. This would effectively isolate the democratic zones and make us either have to give up so the people can eat or find a different way to supply. And we chose to find a different way to supply. Our response to the Berlin blockade was the Berlin airlift. Okay. Now, France was not at a place where it could do this because it was still rebuilding from World War II. So the United States and Britain are going to fly round-the-clock air missions over Berlin. And they are going to airdrop supplies into Western Berlin. We're talking everything. They dropped medicine. They dropped milk. They figured out a way to drop milk from an airplane and keep it from spilling. That's amazing. They dropped, rations, books, anything we could think of to keep the people of Western Berlin going. They dropped gas and coal and anything they needed. We also form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. We call this NATO. It's an alliance formed by United States, Canada, and 10 other Western European countries. Now, these are all countries in Western Europe that are afraid the Soviets are getting too aggressive and the Soviets are going to come for them eventually. And the U.S. and the others in NATO agreed to help any member nation that was attacked. If you get attacked, we will help you no matter what, which is why after 9/11, the NATO countries were automatically behind us whenever we went into Afghanistan, even though it took the United Nations longer. United Nations and NATO are two separate things. They're two separate treaties. NATO countries joined us immediately because that's what our alliance says. It took the United Nations longer because they had to vote. Okay. Soviet Union did not like the fact that we had this giant alliance against them, so they created their own alliance. Okay, because that's how countries work. Apparently, they created their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact was it was considered all the communist countries that were going to work to spread communism. But here's the thing: the only members of the Warsaw Pact were the members of the Soviet Union. And the satellite nations didn't have a choice. Russia made them be part of the Soviet Union. So that's the big difference here. The Warsaw Pact, yes, it is a direct response to the United Nations, but the people are NATO, but people chose to join NATO. Countries were forced into the Warsaw Pact. Okay. So you've got NATO countries in yellow. Okay. Then you have the Soviet Union in the bright green. And then the satellite countries right here. Okay. What you see in yellow, those are all NATO countries. Okay. The green and then the green with the lines in it, that's the Warsaw Pact. And then what you see in gray was part of neither. It wasn't part of either. All right. And then there was one last thing we did. It's called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. Okay. It's an alliance formed by United States, France, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. And these, you'll notice there's only two southeastern countries in that. Okay. The Philippines and Thailand. The Philippines joined because they had ties to the United States, and they were afraid of, communism pressure. Thailand joined because they were afraid of communist pressure. All the other countries in SEATO, they're not necessarily countries in Southeast Asia, but they're all countries that had an interest in Southeast Asia. So they're going to work to keep communism from spreading into Southeast Asia. And the further you go into the Cold War, the more apparent it becomes that it's not so much a direct threat. It's not so much communism invading these countries that's gonna make them go communist. It's the economies collapsing. When things get desperate, people turn to desperate measures. So if the economies of these places start to tank, communists start to sound more popular and the people join communism. So what SEATO does for a lot of it is trying to stabilize the economies of countries in Southeast Asia to prevent them from becoming communist. And that is it.